これは明治中期から昭和初期にかけて製作・出版され、ちりめん本と呼ばれた欧文和綴じ本を動画にしたものです。ちりめん本とは、ネットで検索したところ、国立国会図書館リサーチナビと放送大学附属図書館ギャラリーに適当な解説を見つけたので引用します。明治中期から昭和初期にかけて出版された小型の和綴じ本で、細かくシワを寄せたちりめん状の和紙を使用していることから、ちりめん本と呼ばれます。挿絵入りで日本の昔話などを外国語に翻訳したもので、外国人向けのお土産として人気がありました。中でもよく知られているのは、長谷川公文社の日本昔話シリーズです。長谷川公文社は、ちりめん本を出していた出版社として特に有名で、出版数が多く、作りも大変丁寧でした。以上、国立国会図書館リサーチナビの解説より、明治時代に新しい絵本が生まれました。それは江戸赤本の伝統を組むものでしたが、和紙を使用し、木版多色刷りで挿絵を入れ、文章を活版で印刷し、ちりめん布のような風合いを持った絵入り本で、ちりめん本と呼ばれる欧文和装本でした。ちりめん本の生みの親、長谷川武次郎は、1853年、嘉永6年、江戸に生まれました。武次郎は、当時の日本では、英語を取得することが、学問や商売にとって必須と考え、1869年、明治2年、英語を学び始めました。彼は、近代商業についても学び、貿易や出版に関する知識も習得していきました。商人としてばかりでなく、彼はちりめん本を作る職人たちを取りまとめる際にも長け、英語を駆使して翻訳者と交渉し、国際出版の礎を築いていったのです。こうして1885年、明治18年初秋、武次郎の努力によって、桃太郎や下切りすずめなどを筆頭に、英文による昔話集が生まれ、日本の出版業界が新しい時代への一歩を踏み出したのです。ちりめん本のいろいろ。ちりめん本日本昔話集では、英語版の他にフランス語版、スペイン語版、ポルトガル語版、およびドイツ語版などが出版されました。表紙を比べると、各版とも同じ絵柄に見えますが、細部やすり色などは微妙に違っています。日本昔話集の他に、日本の文化や風俗をテーマにした書籍や、暦なども出版されました。本学附属図書館では、多少ですが、イタリア語版やオランダ語版の暦も所蔵しています。以上、放送大学附属図書館ギャラリーの解説より、ちりめん本の日本の昔話は、原作を忠実に外国語に訳したものではなく、欧米文化圏の人々に受け入れられやすいように改変した内容になっています。こうした改変点を見つけて、それがどういう理由、目的で行われたのかなど、推理してみるのも面白いと思います。
Japanese Fairy Tale Chin Chin Kobakama Rendered into English by Lafcadio Hearn. The floor of a Japanese room is covered with beautiful thick soft mats of woven reeds. They fit very closely together, so that you can just slip a knife blade between them. They are changed once every year, and are kept very clean. The Japanese never wear shoes in the house, and do not use chairs or furniture such as English people use. They sit, sleep, eat, and sometimes even write upon the floor. So the mats must be kept very clean indeed, and Japanese children are taught, just as soon as they can speak, never to spoil or dirty the mats. Now Japanese children are really very good. All travelers, who have written pleasant books about Japan, declare that Japanese children are much more obedient than English children and much less mischievous. They do not spoil and dirty things, and they do not even break their own toys. A little Japanese girl does not break her doll. No, she takes great care of it, and keeps it even after she becomes a woman and is married. When she becomes a mother, and has a daughter, she gives the doll to that little daughter. And the child takes the same care of the doll that her mother did, and preserves it until she grows up, and gives it at last to her own children, who play with it just as nicely as their grandmother did. So I, who am writing this little story for you, have seen in Japan, dolls more than 100 years old, looking just as pretty as when they were new. This will show you how very good Japanese children are, and you will be able to understand why the floor of a Japanese room is nearly always kept clean, not scratched and spoiled by mischievous play. You ask me whether all Japanese children are as good as that? Well, no, there are a very few naughty ones. And what happens to the mats in the houses of these naughty children? Nothing very bad, because there are fairies who take care of the mats. These fairies tease and frighten children who dirty or spoil the mats. At least, they used to tease and frighten such mischievous children. I am not quite sure whether those little fairies still live in Japan, because the new railways and the telegraph poles have frightened a great many fairies away. But here is a little story about them. Once there was a little girl who was very pretty, but also very lazy. Her parents were rich, and had a great many servants, and these servants were very fond of the little girl, and did everything for her which she ought to have been able to do for herself. Perhaps this was what made her so lazy. When she grew up into a beautiful woman, she still remained lazy, but as the servants always dressed and undressed her, and arranged her hair, she looked very charming, and nobody thought about her faults. At last she was married to a brave warrior, and went away with him to live in another house where there were but few servants. She was sorry not to have as many servants as she had had at home, because she was obliged to do several things for herself, which other folks had always done for her. It was such trouble to her to dress herself, and take care of her own clothes, and keep herself looking neat and pretty to please her husband. But as he was a warrior, and often had to be far away from home with the army, she could sometimes be just as lazy as she wished. Her husband's parents were very old and good-natured, and never scolded her. Well, one night while her husband was away with the army, she was awakened by queer little noises in her room. By the light of a big paper lantern she could see very well, and she saw strange things. What? Hundreds of little men, dressed just like Japanese warriors, but only about 1 inch high, were dancing all around her pillow. They wore the same kind of dress her husband wore on holidays, kamishimo, a long robe with square shoulders, and their hair was tied up in knots, and each wore 2 tiny swords. They all looked at her as they danced and laughed, and they all sang the same song, over and over again.
ちんちんこばかま、夜も更け候、お静まれ、姫君、やとんとん。
Which meant, we are the Chinchin Kobakama. The hour is late, sleep, honorable noble darling. The words seemed very polite, but she soon saw that the little men were only making cruel fun of her. They also made ugly faces at her. She tried to catch some of them, but they jumped about so quickly that she could not. Then she tried to drive them away, but they would not go, and they never stopped singing Chin Chin ko ba kama, and laughing at her. Then she knew they were little fairies, and became so frightened that she could not even cry out. They danced around her until morning, then they all vanished suddenly. She was ashamed to tell anybody what had happened, because, as she was the wife of a warrior, she did not wish anybody to know how frightened she had been. Next night, again the little men came and danced, and they came also the night after that, and every night, always at the same hour, which the old Japanese used to call the hour of the ox, that is, about 2 o'clock in the morning by our time. At last she became very sick, through want of sleep and through fright. But the little men would not leave her alone. When her husband came back home, he was very sorry to find her sick in bed. At first she was afraid to tell him what had made her ill, for fear that he would laugh at her. But he was so kind, and coaxed her so gently, that after a while she told him what happened every night. He did not laugh at her at all, but looked very serious for a time. Then he asked, "At what time do they come?" She answered, "Always at the same hour, the hour of the ox." "Very well," said her husband, "tonight I shall hide and watch for them. Do not be frightened." So that night the warrior hid himself in a closet in the sleeping room, and kept watch through a chink between the sliding doors. He waited and watched until the hour of the ox. Then, all at once, the little men came up through the mats, and began their dance and their song.
ちんちんこばかま、夜も更け候。
They looked so queer, and danced in such a funny way, that the warrior could scarcely keep from laughing. But he saw his young wife's frightened face, and then remembering that nearly all Japanese ghosts and goblins are afraid of a sword, he drew his blade, and rushed out of the closet, and struck at the little dancers. Immediately they all turned into, what do you think? Toothpicks. There were no more little warriors, only a lot of old toothpicks scattered over the mats. The young wife had been too lazy to put her toothpicks away properly, and every day, after having used a new toothpick, she would stick it down between the mats on the floor, to get rid of it. So the little fairies who take care of the floor mats became angry with her, and tormented her. Her husband scolded her, and she was so ashamed that she did not know what to do. A servant was called, and the toothpicks were taken away and burned. After that the little men never came back again. There is also a story told about a lazy little girl, who used to eat plums, and afterward hide the plum stones between the floor mats. For a long time she was able to do this without being found out. But at last the fairies got angry and punished her. For every night, tiny women, all wearing bright red robes with very long sleeves, rose up from the floor at the same hour, and danced, and made faces at her and prevented her from sleeping. Her mother one night sat up to watch, and saw them, and struck at them, and they all turned into plum stones. So the naughtiness of that little girl was found out. After that she became a very good girl indeed.
Japanese Fairy Tales. Second Series, Number 1. The Goblin Spider. By Lafcadia Hearn. T. Hasegawa, Publisher, Tokyo. The Goblin Spider. Rendered into English by Lafcadia Hearn. In very ancient books it is said that there used to be many goblin spiders in Japan. Some folks declare there are still some goblin spiders. During the daytime they look just like common spiders, but very late at night, when everybody is asleep, and there is no sound, they become very, very big, and do awful things. Goblin spiders are supposed also to have the magical power of taking human shape, so as to deceive people, and there is a famous Japanese story about such a spider. There was once, in some lonely part of the country, a haunted temple. No one could live in the building because of the goblins that had taken possession of it. Many brave samurai went to that place at various times for the purpose of killing the goblins, but they were never heard of again after they had entered the temple. At last one who was famous for his courage and his prudence went to the temple to watch during the night, and he said to those who accompanied him there, "If in the morning I be still alive, I shall drum upon the drum of the temple." Then he was left alone, to watch by the light of a lamp. As the night advanced he crouched down under the altar, which supported a dusty image of Buddha. He saw nothing strange and heard no sound till after midnight. Then there came a goblin, having but half a body and one eye, and said, "Hitwoku sai." There is the smell of a man. But the samurai did not move. The goblin went away. Then there came a priest and played upon a samisen so wonderfully that the samurai felt sure it was not the playing of a man, so he leaped up with his sword drawn. The priest, seeing him, burst out laughing, and said, "So you thought I was a goblin? Oh no, I am only the priest of this temple, but I have to play to keep off the goblins. Does not this samisen sound well? Please play a little." And he offered the instrument to the samurai, who grasped it very cautiously with his left hand, but instantly the samisen changed into a monstrous spider web, and the priest into a goblin spider, and the warrior found himself caught fast in the web by the left hand. He struggled bravely, and struck at the spider with his sword, and wounded it, but he soon became entangled still more in the net, and could not move. However, the wounded spider crawled away, and the sun rose. In a little while the people came and found the samurai in the horrible web, and freed him. They saw tracks of blood upon the floor, and followed the tracks out of the temple to a hole in the deserted garden. Out of the hole issued a frightful sound of groaning. They found the wounded goblin in the hole, and killed it. Japanese fairy tale. The Fountain of Youth. Rendered into English by Lafcadio Hearn. All rights reserved. T. Hasegawa, Tokyo. Long, long ago there lived somewhere among the mountains of Japan a poor woodcutter and his wife. They were very old, and had no children. Every day the husband went alone to the forest to cut wood, while the wife sat weaving at home. One day the old man went further into the forest than was his custom, to seek a certain kind of wood, and he suddenly found himself at the edge of a little spring he had never seen before. The water was strangely clear and cold, and he was thirsty, for the day was hot, and he had been working hard. So he doffed his huge straw hat, knelt down, and took a long drink. That water seemed to refresh him in a most extraordinary way. Then he caught sight of his own face in the spring, and started back. It was certainly his own face, but not at all as he was accustomed to see it in the bronze mirror at home. It was the face of a very young man. He could not believe his eyes. He put up both hands to his head, which had been quite bald only a moment before, when he had wiped it with the little blue towel he always carried with him. But now it was covered with thick back hair, and his face had become smooth as a boy's. Every wrinkle was gone. At the same moment he discovered himself full of new strength. He stared in astonishment at the limbs that had been so long withered age. They were now shapely and hard with dense young muscle. Unknowingly he had drunk of the fountain of youth, and that draught had transformed him. First he leaped high and shouted for joy. Then he ran home faster than he had ever run before in his life. When he entered his house his wife was frightened, because she took him for a stranger, and when he told her the wonder, she could not at once believe him. But after a long time he was able to convince her that the young man she now saw before her was really her husband, and he told her where the spring was, and asked her to go there with him. Then she said, "You have become so handsome and so young that you cannot continue to love an old woman. So I must drink some of that water immediately, but it will never do for both of us to be away from the house at the same time. Do you wait here, while I go." And she ran to the woods all by herself. She found the spring and knelt down, and began to drink. Oh, how cool and sweet that water was! She drank and drank and drank, and stopped for breath only to begin again. Her husband waited for her impatiently. He expected to see her come back changed into a pretty slender girl, but she did not come back at all. He got anxious, shut up the house, and went to look for her. When he reached the spring, he could not see her. He was just on the point of returning when he heard a little wail in the high grass near the spring. He searched there and discovered his wife's clothes and a baby, a very small baby, perhaps 6 months old. For the old woman had drunk too deeply of the magical water. She had drunk herself far back beyond the time of youth into the period of speechless infancy. He took up the child in his arms. It looked at him in a sad wondering way. He carried it home, murmuring to it, thinking strange melancholy thoughts.
Japanese fairy tale. The Boy Who Drew Cats. Rendered into English by Lafcadio Hearn. All rights reserved. T. Hasegawa, publisher and art printer. 17 Kami Negishi, Tokyo. The Boy Who Drew Cats. By Lafcadio Hearn. A long time ago, in a small country village in Japan, there lived a poor farmer and his wife, who were very good people. They had a number of children, and found it very hard to feed them all. The elder son was strong enough when only 14 years old to help his father, and the little girls learned to help their mother almost as soon as they could walk. But the youngest child, a little boy, did not seem to be fit for hard work. He was very clever, cleverer than all his brothers and sisters, but he was quite weak and small, and people said he could never grow very big. So his parents thought it would be better for him to become a priest than to become a farmer. They took him with them to the village temple one day, and asked the good old priest who lived there, if he would have their little boy for his acolyte, and teach him all that a priest ought to know. The old man spoke kindly to the lad, and asked him some hard questions. So clever were the answers that the priest agreed to take the little fellow into the temple as an acolyte, and to educate him for the priesthood. The boy learned quickly what the old priest taught him, and was very obedient in most things. But he had one fault. He liked to draw cats during study hours, and to draw cats even where cats ought not to have been drawn at all. Whenever he found himself alone, he drew cats. He drew them on the margins of the priest's books, and on all the screens of the temple, and on the walls, and on the pillars. Several times the priest told him this was not right, but he did not stop drawing cats. He drew them because he could not really help it. He had what is called the genius of an artist, and just for that reason he was not quite fit to be an acolyte. A good acolyte should study books. One day after he had drawn some very clever pictures of cats upon a paper screen, the old priest said to him severely, "My boy, you must go away from this temple at once. You will never make a good priest, but perhaps you will become a great artist. Now let me give you a last piece of advice, and be sure you never forget it. Avoid large places at night, keep to small." The boy did not know what the priest meant by saying, "Avoid large places, keep to small." He thought and thought, while he was tying up his little bundle of clothes to go away, but he could not understand those words, and he was afraid to speak to the priest any more, except to say goodbye. He left the temple very sorrowfully, and began to wonder what he should do. If he went straight home he felt sure his father would punish him for having been disobedient to the priest, so he was afraid to go home. All at once he remembered that at the next village, 12 miles away, there was a very big temple. He had heard there were several priests at that temple, and he made up his mind to go to them and ask them to take him for their acolyte. Now that big temple was closed up, but the boy did not know this fact. The reason it had been closed up was that a goblin had frightened the priests away, and had taken possession of the place. Some brave warriors had afterward gone to the temple at night to kill the goblin, but they had never been seen alive again. Nobody had ever told these things to the boy, so he walked all the way to the village hoping to be kindly treated by the priests. When he got to the village it was already dark, and all the people were in bed, but he saw the big temple on a hill at the other end of the principal street, and he saw there was a light in the temple. People who tell the story say the goblin used to make that light, in order to tempt lonely travelers to ask for shelter. The boy went at once to the temple, and knocked. There was no sound inside. He knocked and knocked again, but still nobody came. At last he pushed gently at the door, and was quite glad to find that it had not been fastened. So he went in, and saw a lamp burning, but no priest. He thought some priest would be sure to come very soon, and he sat down and waited. Then he noticed that everything in the temple was grey with dust, and thickly spun over with cobwebs. So he thought to himself that the priests would certainly like to have an acolyte, to keep the place clean. He wondered why they had allowed everything to get so dusty. What most pleased him, however, were some big white screens, good to paint cats upon. Though he was tired, he looked at once for a writing box, and found one, and ground some ink, and began to paint cats. He painted a great many cats upon the screens, and then he began to feel very, very sleepy. He was just on the point of lying down to sleep beside one of the screens, when he suddenly remembered the words, "Avoid large places, keep to small." The temple was very large, he was all alone, and as he thought of these words, though he could not quite understand them, he began to feel for the first time a little afraid, and he resolved to look for a small place in which to sleep. He found a little cabinet, with a sliding door, and went into it, and shut himself up. Then he lay down and fell fast asleep. Very late in the night he was awakened by a most terrible noise, a noise of fighting and screaming. It was so dreadful that he was afraid even to look through a chink of the little cabinet. He lay very still, holding his breath for fright. The light that had been in the temple went out, but the awful sounds continued, and became more awful, and all the temple shook. After a long time silence came, but the boy was still afraid to move. He did not move until the light of the morning sun shone into the cabinet through the chinks of the little door. Then he got out of his hiding place very cautiously, and looked about. The first thing he saw was that all the floor of the temple was covered with blood. And then he saw, lying dead in the middle of it, an enormous, monstrous rat, a goblin rat, bigger than a cow. But who or what could have killed it? There was no man or other creature to be seen. Suddenly the boy observed that the mouths of all the cats he had drawn the night before were red and wet with blood. Then he knew that the goblin had been killed by the cats which he had drawn. And then also, for the first time, he understood why the wise old priest had said to him, "Avoid large places at night, keep to small." Afterward that boy became a very famous artist. Some of the cats which he drew are still shown to travelers in Japan.
Japanese fairy tale The Old Woman Who Lost Her Dumpling. Rendered into English by Katie O'Hearn. All rights reserved. T. Hasegawa. publisher and art printer. 17 Kami Negishi, Tokyo. Long ago there was a funny old woman, who liked to laugh and to make dumplings of rice flour. One day, while she was preparing some dumplings for dinner, she let one fall, and it rolled into a hole in the earthen floor of her little kitchen and disappeared. The old woman tried to reach it by putting her hand down the hole, and all at once the earth gave way, and the old woman fell in. She fell quite a distance, but was not a bit hurt, and when she got up on her feet again, she saw that she was standing on a road, just like the road before her house. It was quite light down there, and she could see plenty of rice fields, but no one in them. How all this happened, I cannot tell you, but it seems that the old woman had fallen into another country. The road she had fallen upon sloped very much, so, after having looked for her dumpling in vain, she thought that it must have rolled farther away down the slope. She ran down the road to look, crying, "My dumpling, my dumpling! Where is that dumpling of mine?" After a little while she saw a stone Jizzo standing by the roadside, and she said, "Oh Lord Jizzo, did you see my dumpling?" Jizzo answered, "Yes, I saw your dumpling rolling by me down the road, but you had better not go any farther, because there is a wicked Oni living down there, who eats people." But the old woman only laughed, and ran on further down the road, crying, "My dumpling, my dumpling! Where is that dumpling of mine?" And she came to another statue of Jizzo, and asked it, "Oh kind Lord Jizzo, did you see my dumpling?" And Jizzo said, "Yes, I saw your dumpling go by a little while ago, but you must not run any further, because there is a wicked Oni down there, who eats people." But she only laughed, and ran on, still crying out, "My dumpling, my dumpling! Where is that dumpling of mine?" And she came to a third Jizzo, and asked it, "Oh dear Lord Jizzo, did you see my dumpling?" But Jizzo said, "Don't talk about your dumpling now, here is the Oni coming, squat down here behind my sleeve, and don't make any noise." Presently the Oni came very close, and stopped and bowed to Jizzo, and said, "Good day, Jizzo-san." Jizzo said good day, too, very politely. Then the Oni suddenly snuffed the air 2 or 3 times in a suspicious way, and cried out, "Jizzo-san, Jizzo-san, I smell a smell of mankind somewhere, don't you?" "Oh," said Jizzo. "Perhaps you are mistaken." "No, no," said the Oni after snuffing the air again. "I smell a smell of mankind." Then the old woman could not help laughing. "Te hei hei." And the Oni immediately reached down his big hairy hand behind Jizzo's sleeve, and pulled her out, still laughing. "Te hei hei." "Aha!" cried the Oni. Then Jizzo said, "What are you going to do with that good old woman? You must not hurt her." "I won't," said the Oni. "But I will take her home with me to cook for us." "Te hei hei," laughed the old woman. "Very well," said Jizzo. "But you must really be kind to her. If you are not, I shall be very angry." "I won't hurt her at all," promised the Oni. "And she will only have to do a little work for us every day. Goodbye, Jizzo-san." Then the Oni took the old woman far down the road, till they came to a wide deep river. There was a boat. He put her into the boat, and took her across the river to his house. It was a very large house. He led her once into the kitchen, and told her to cook some dinner for himself and the other Oni who lived with him, and he gave her a small wooden rice paddle, and said, "You must always put only 1 grain of rice into the pot, and when you stir that 1 grain of rice in the water with this paddle, the grain will multiply until the pot is full." So the old woman put just one rice grain into the pot, as the Oni told her, and began to stir it with the paddle, and, as she stirred, the one grain became 2, then 4, then 8, then 16, 32, 64, and so on. Every time she moved the paddle the rice increased in quantity, and in a few minutes the great pot was full. After that, the funny old woman stayed a long time in the house of the Oni, and every day cooked food for him and for all his friends. The Oni never hurt or frightened her, and her work was made quite easy by the magic paddle, although she had to cook a very, very great quantity of rice, because an Oni eats much more than any human being eats. But she felt lonely, and always wished very much to go back to her own little house, and make her dumplings. And one day, when the Oni were all out somewhere, she thought she would try to run away. She first took the magic paddle, and slipped it under her girdle, and then she went down to the river. No one saw her, and the boat was there. She got into it, and pushed off, and as she could row very well, she was soon far away from the shore. But the river was wide, and she had not rowed more than 1/4 of the way across, when the Oni, all of them, came back to the house. They found that their cook was gone, and the magic paddle, too. They ran down to the river at once, and saw the old woman rowing away very fast. Perhaps they could not swim, at all events they had no boat, and they thought the only way they could catch the funny old woman would be to drink up all the water of the river before she got to the other bank. So they knelt down, and began to drink so fast that before the old woman had got halfway over, the water had become quite low. But the old woman kept on rowing until the water had got so shallow that the Oni stopped drinking, and began to wade across. Then she dropped her oar, took the magic paddle from her girdle, and shook it at the Oni, and made such funny faces that the Oni all burst out laughing. But the moment they laughed, they could not help throwing up all the water they had drunk, and so the river became full again. The Oni could not cross, and the funny old woman got safely over to the other side, and ran away up the road as fast as she could. She never stopped running until she found herself at home again. After that she was very happy, for she could make dumplings whenever she pleased. Besides, she had the magic paddle to make rice for her. She sold her dumplings to her neighbors and passengers, and in quite a short time she became rich.
Japanese Fairy Tale Series, Number 17. Ship It Taro. Translated by Mrs. T.H. James. All rights reserved. Published by Y. Nishinamiya, 17 Kami Negishi, Tokyo. Preface. The following story has been current in all parts of Japan from ancient times. Slightly different versions exist in different provinces, but the most widely known is the one here given. The picture of the dog on another page is a copy of one now issued from Mitsumine or Mitakasan to the faithful who reverence it as Akachishinjin, the large-mouthed god, to serve as a charm to keep away devils and thieves. The original was no doubt something like the dog Ship It Taro. Should the children who read this book ever visit Japan, they might see it pasted up above the door, on the outside, of some house even yet. Ship It Taro. Long, long ago, in the days of fairies and giants, ogres and dragons, valiant knights and distressed damsels, in those good old days, a brave young warrior went out into the wide world in search of adventures. For some time he went on without meeting with anything out of the common, but at length, after journeying through a thick forest, he found himself, one evening, on a wild and lonely mountain side. No village was in sight, no cottage, not even the hut of a charcoal burner, so often to be found on the outskirts of the forest. He had been following a faint and much overgrown path, but at length even that was lost sight of. Twilight was coming on, and in vain he strove to recover the lost track. Each effort seemed only to entangle him more hopelessly in the briars and tall grasses which grew thickly on all sides. Faint and weary he stumbled on in the fast-gathering darkness, until suddenly he came upon a little temple, deserted and half-ruined, but which still contained a shrine. Here at least was shelter from the chilly dews, and here he resolved to pass the night. Food he had none, but wrapped in his mantle, and with his good sword by his side, he lay down, and was soon fast asleep. Towards midnight he was awakened by a dreadful noise. At first he thought it must be a dream, but the noise continued, the whole place resounding with the most terrible shrieks and yells. The young warrior raised himself cautiously, and seizing his sword, looked through a hole in the ruined wall. He beheld a strange and awful sight. A troop of hideous cats were engaged in a wild and horrible dance, their yells meanwhile echoing through the night. Mingled with their unearthly cries the young warrior could clearly distinguish the words, "Tell it not to Ship It Taro. Keep it close and dark. Tell it not to Ship It Taro." A beautiful clear full moon shed its light upon this gruesome scene, which the young warrior watched with amazement and horror. Suddenly, the midnight hour being past, the phantom cats disappeared, and all was silence once more. The rest of the night passed undisturbed, and the young warrior slept soundly until morning. When he awoke the sun was already up, and he hastened to leave the scene of last night's adventure. By the bright morning light he presently discovered traces of a path which the evening before had been invisible. This he followed, and found to his great joy, that it led, not as he had feared to the forest through which he had come the day before, but in the opposite direction, towards an open plain. There he saw one or two scattered cottages, and, a little further on, a village. Pressed by hunger, he was making the best of his way towards the village, when he heard the tones of a woman's voice loud in lamentation and entreaty. No sooner did these sounds of distress reach the warrior's ears, than his hunger was forgotten, and he hurried on to the nearest cottage to find out what was the matter, and if he could give any help. The people listened to his questions, and shaking their heads sorrowfully, told him that all help was vain. "Every year," said they, "the mountain spirit claims a victim. The time has come, and this very night will he devour our loveliest maiden. This is the cause of the wailing and lamentation." And when the young warrior, filled with wonder, inquired further, they told him that at sunset the victim would be put into a sort of cage and carried to that very ruined temple, where he had passed the night, and there left alone. In the morning she would have vanished. So it was each year, and so it would be now. There was no help for it. As he listened, the young warrior was filled with an earnest desire to deliver the maiden, and the mention of the ruined shrine having brought back to his mind the adventure of the night before, he asked the people whether they had ever heard the name of Ship It Taro, and who and what he was. "Ship It Taro is a strong and beautiful dog," was the reply. "He belongs to the head man of our prince who lives only a little way from here. We often see him following his master. He is a fine brave fellow." The young knight did not stop to ask more questions, but hurried off to Ship It Taro's master and begged him to lend his dog for one night. At first the man was unwilling, but at length agreed to lend Ship It Taro on condition that he should be brought back the next day. Overjoyed, the young warrior led the dog away. Next he went to see the parents of the unhappy maiden, and told them to keep her in the house and watch her carefully until his return. He then placed the dog Ship It Taro in the cage which had been prepared for the maiden, and with the help of some of the young men of the village, carried it to the ruined temple, and there set it down. The young men refused to stay one moment on that haunted spot, but hurried down the mountain as if the whole troop of hobgoblins had been at their heels. The young warrior, with no companion but the dog, remained to see what would happen. At midnight, when the full moon was high in the heaven, and shed her light over the mountain, came the phantom cats once more. This time they had in their midst a huge black tom cat, fiercer and more terrible than all the rest, and which the young warrior had no difficulty in knowing as the frightful mountain fiend himself. No sooner did this monster catch sight of the cage than he danced and sprang round it with yells of triumph and hideous joy, followed by his companions. When he had long enough jeered at and taunted his victim, he threw open the door of the cage. But this time he met his match. The brave Chipitero sprang upon him, and seizing him with his teeth, held him fast, while the young warrior with one stroke of his good sword laid the monster dead at his feet. As for the other cats, too much astonished to fly, they stood gazing at the dead body of their leader, and were made short work of by the knight and Chipitero. The young warrior brought back the brave dog to his master with 1,000 thanks, told the father and mother of the maiden that their daughter was free, and the people of the village that the fiend had claimed his last victim, and would trouble them no more. "You owe all this to the brave Chipitero," he said as he bade them farewell, and went his way in search of fresh adventures. Japanese Fairy Tale Series, Number 11. The Hair of Inaba. Published by Y. Nishinamiya, Tokyo. All rights reserved. The Hair of Inaba. Now, there were once 81 brothers, who princes in the land. They were all jealous of one another, each one wishing to be king, to rule over the others, and over the whole kingdom. Besides this, each one wanted to marry the same princess. She was the princess of Yakami and Inaba. At last they made up their minds that they would go together to Inaba, and each one try to persuade the princess to marry him. Although 80 of these brothers were jealous of one another, yet they all agreed in hating, and being unkind to the 81st, who was good and gentle, and did not like their rough, quarrelsome ways. When they set out upon their journey, they made the poor 81st brother walk behind them, and carry the bag, just as if he had been their servant, although he was their own brother, and as much a prince as any of them all. By and by, the 80 princes came to Cape Cata, and there they found a poor hare, with all his fur plucked out, lying down very sick and miserable. The 80 princes said to the hare, "We will tell you what you should do. Go and bathe in the sea water, and then lie down on the slope of a high mountain, and let the wind blow upon you. That will soon make your fur grow, we promise you." So the poor hare believed them, and went and bathed in the sea, and afterwards lay down in the sun and the wind to dry. But, as the salt water dried, the skin of his body all cracked and split with the sun and the wind, so that he was in terrible pain, and lay there crying, in a much worse state than he was before. Now the 81st brother was long way behind the others, because he had the luggage to carry, but at last he came up, staggering under the weight of the heavy bag. When he saw the hare he asked, "Why are you lying there crying?" "Oh dear," said the hare. "Just stop a moment and I will tell you all my story. I was in the island of Oki, and I wanted to cross over to this land. I didn't know how to get over, but at last I hit upon a plan. I said to the sea crocodiles, 'Let us count how many crocodiles there are in the sea, and how many hares there are in the land. And now to begin with the crocodiles. Come, every one of you, and lie down in a row, across from this island to Cape Cata, then I will step upon each one, and count you as I run across. When I have finished counting you, we can count the hares, and then we shall know whether there are most hares, or most crocodiles.' The crocodiles came and lay down in a row. Then I stepped on them and counted them as I ran across, and was just going to jump on shore, when I laughed and said, 'You silly crocodiles, I don't care how many of you there are. I only wanted a bridge to get across by. Oh, why did I boast until I was safe on dry land? For the last crocodile, the one which lay at the very end of the row, seized me, and plucked off all my fur. And serve you right too, for being so tricky,' said the 81st brother. However, go on with your story. As I was lying here crying," continued the hare, "the 80 princes who went by before you told me to bathe in salt water and lie down in the wind. I did as they told me, but I am 10 times worse than before, and my whole body is smarting and sore." Then the 81st brother said to the hare, "Go quickly now to the river, it is quite near. Wash yourself well with the fresh water, then take the pollen of the sedges growing on the river bank, spread it about on the ground, and roll among it. If you do this, your skin will heal, and your fur grow again." So the hare did as he was told, and this time he was quite cured, and his fur grew thicker than ever. Then the hare said to the 81st brother, "As for those 80 princes, your brothers, they shall not get the princess of Inaba. Although you carry the bag, yet your highness shall at last get both the princess and the country." Which things came to pass, for the princess would have nothing to do with those 80 bad brothers, but chose the 81st who was kind and good. Then he was made king of the country, and lived happily all his life. Japanese Fairy Tale Series, Number 19. The Ogres of Oyama. T. Hasegawa, Tokyo, Japan. The great warrior Reiko had received orders from the Mikado to punish the ogres who lived in Oyama, and to rescue from their clutches the captives they had seized and carried off to their stronghold. For in those days there was hardly a family in Kyoto which had not to mourn the loss of one or more of its members. No one had as yet had courage to make an attack upon the ogre's castle. Watanabe Tsuna, one of Reiko's followers, had indeed lain in wait for Shu Tendaji, the chief of the ogres, at the gate called Rashomon, in Kyoto. There a famous struggle had taken place in which, Tuff the ogre escaped him, Tsuna had cut off, and carried away in triumph the monster's arm. Shu Tendaji, however, by means of a clever trick, got back his arm again, and he, and his horrible crew, from this time forward, became bolder and bolder, until at last the whole city was filled with terror and mourning. Reiko was delighted to receive the Mikado's order. Indeed, this was all he had been waiting for, as he and his band had long vowed the destruction of the ogres. Reiko then, with Tsuna and his other followers, prepared for their journey. Well armed, and with their good swords in their belts, this brave little band, consisting of but 5 warriors, set off towards the mountain still known as the Ogre's Hill, at the top of which they expected to find the monster's den. But the path was rough, if not indeed actually dangerous, and often they lost traces of it altogether, while the thick trees prevented their seeing any distance before them. At length their difficulties increased so much that they were at a loss which way to turn, when there suddenly appeared in front of them an old man of mild and venerable aspect. His long and snow-white beard flowed down over his rich garment, while his countenance beamed with heavenly radiance like a bright spring morning. Reiko bowed low, and addressing himself to the old man, asked him if they were in the right way to the ogre's mountain. "What would you seek there, my son?" demanded the old man in his turn. Then Reiko took out a little bag of rich gold brocade, and from it drew the Mikado's order, clearly written in large letters. "I command you, Reiko, to punish the ogres." When the old man had read the order, he spoke thus to Reiko. "My son, only in one way can you hope to fulfill this command. Your swords are powerless against these monsters, and if you trust to them alone, you will soon be dead men. Shu Tendaji, as his name truly signifies, only lives to eat and, above all, to drink. Through his love of wine shall you overcome him. Follow me." So saying, the old man led the warriors to his dwelling on the hillside, and after he had set food before them, and they had refreshed themselves, he brought out these gifts. For Reiko a helmet which was proof against every weapon, a magic sword and drinking flagon or goblet. This flagon had 2 mouths, and was so cunningly contrived that, Though to outward appearance it was one vessel, yet, by means of a secret division, it could be made to contain two separate and distinct liquors. Besides, he disguised the warriors in the garments of Yamabushi, or mountain hermits, the flowing robes quite concealing the armor and weapons which they all wore beneath. Added to this, the old man gave to Reiko some of the famous wine of Sakai, and a small white powder, which was in truth the most powerful sleeping drug. Then he gave them full directions as to the path they should follow, and also as to their behavior when they should have gained admittance into the ogre's castle. "Go, my sons, and may heaven prosper you," said the old man as they bade him a grateful farewell. Thus equipped, and filled with new courage, the little band set out once more. As they journeyed, they talked to each other of the kindness and wisdom of the old man from whom they had just parted. And as they talked, a sudden light seemed to burst upon them, and they with one voice exclaimed, "This was no mere mortal, the gods themselves have come to our help." So saying, they turned round, and bowed their faces to the ground, worshipping. Over mountain and through glen they took their way, fording the streams, for bridges there were none, and climbing steep precipices, aided often by the rope-like stems of the wild wisteria. After a hard day's march, they came, towards evening, to the foot of a thickly wooded hill. There they met with a beautiful maiden engaged in washing blood-stained garments in the mountain torrent, which here flowed more quietly through the valley. The warriors, in surprise, asked her what she did alone in this desolate spot. "Alas, sirs," she answered, "I am a captive, and am obliged to do the bidding of my masters, the ogres. Fly, I beseech you, while yet there is time, from this haunted spot." "No indeed," said Reiko. "We have come on purpose to find the ogre's den. Before morning you shall be free." So leaving the maid in astonishment, they began to climb the mountain. They had not gone far when they met a young ogre, who was cook to Shutendaji. What was the horror of the warriors to find that he was carrying home part of a human body, which he meant to cook for the ogre's supper. Indeed, all around, lay human bones, bleaching in the sun, which had been flung down the precipice from the ogre's kitchen. Hiding his disgust as well as he could, Reiko bade the ogre good evening, and asked him politely if he and his friends could find shelter for the night in his master's castle. "We are poor mountain priests," said Reiko, "traveling to Kyoto, and have lost our way. As it is now near sunset, and we are both faint and weary, we hope you master will not send us away." The young ogre readily agreed to state their case to Shutendaji, thinking all the time to himself, "What a fine feast we shall have off these fat old priests." And now they came in sight of the castle. Dark and gloomy it looked, among tall pine trees, and giant rocks of weird and curious shape. The demon cook begged the pretended priests to wait at the gate while he learned his master's pleasure concerning them, but soon returning, led them into the presence of Shutendaji himself. The monster was seated at the upper end of a long hall. Around him were soft cushions, and silken curtains, and scattered about lay drinking cups and bottles. But who can describe the horrible aspect of the ogre, as he reclined on a golden arm-rest? With his red body, hideous features and copper-colored horns, he was enough to strike terror into the boldest heart. Shutendaji, however, received the pretended priests with much condescension, and invited them to sup and spend the evening with him. The supper was soon brought in by attendant ogres, and consisted mainly of animals' heads, and human bones, though there was also a dish or two of wild boar and other game. Reiko and his comrades were almost sick with the sight, yet dared not refuse to partake of this ghastly feast. The ogre and his lords were too busy with their own meal, which they devoured ravenously, to notice that their guests did no more than feign to eat, and in reality left the disgusting morsels untasted. All this time wine had been flowing like water. Indeed, there was a large tub of it standing near, from which smaller vessels were constantly being filled. Some of these vessels, frightful to tell, were human skulls, and were handed to the ogres by captive maidens whom they forced to wait upon them. When Reiko saw that Shutendaji had drunk a great deal, and that the fun was becoming fast and furious, he thought that now was his time to act. So stepping forward, he offered to show them the Kyoto dance for which he was famous. He danced so well, and handled his fan with so much grace that the drunken ogres screamed with delight, making the hall echo again to their shouts. Then producing the double drinking stoup, Reiko offered it to Shutendaji, assuring him that it contained some of the finest Sakai wine. Reiko had before this taken an opportunity of filling both compartments of the stoup with wine, but into one of them he had cunningly dropped the white powder. This side of the flagon he took care should always be presented to the ogre and his lords, while he and his followers as carefully drank out of the other. Shutendaji loudly praised the wine, and was not content until he had drained the last drop. Though he had allowed the other ogres to have a sip, yet he had drunk the lion's share himself, so that he was soon asleep, and snoring like the sound of distant thunder, and before long most of his retainers had followed his example. Then up rose Reiko and gave the signal to his comrades. Drawing their swords, they soon made short work of the sleeping ogres, while Reiko came near to Shutendaji wielding the magic sword, the gift of the gods. As he raised his hands to strike, the blade lengthened of its own accord, and with one blow the monster's head was severed from his body. In a moment the hideous head flew up into the air, the mouth opening and shutting, the teeth grinding, the eyes rolling, and the horns springing out to an appalling length. 7 times it whirled round, and then made a dash at Reiko's head, and it would have fared badly with the hero, but for the armor by which he was protected. The demon's teeth bit through the hat, but were powerless against the helmet. The head fell at length to the ground with a heavy thud, and the victory was won. After they had slain the ogres, Reiko and his brave comrades released the captives, divided the spoil, and finally set fire to the castle, destroying at once and forever that abode of wickedness. Then the brave warriors, followed by the rejoicing band of released captives, gladly took their way home, bearing the head of Shutendaji with them. But before leaving the ogre's hill they reverently buried the bones of former victims, and set up a stone to mark the spot. Reiko received honors and rewards from the Mikado, and the everlasting gratitude of the citizens of Kyoto, whom he had thus delivered from the raids of the ogres. Japanese Fairy Tale Series, Number 13. The Silly Jellyfish. Translated by B. H. Chamberlain. The Silly Jellyfish. Once upon a time the king of the dragons, who had till then lived as a bachelor, took it into his head to get married. His bride was a young dragonette just 16 years old, lovely enough, in very sooth, to become the wife of a king. Great were the rejoicings on the occasion. The fishes, both great and small, came to pay their respects, and to offer gifts to the newly wedded pair. And for some days all was feasting and merriment. But alas, even dragons have their trials. Before a month had passed, the young dragon queen fell ill. The doctors dosed her with every medicine that was known to them, but all to no purpose. At last they shook their heads, declaring that there was nothing more to be done. The illness must take its course, and she would probably die. But the sick queen said to her husband, "I know of something that will cure me. Only fetch me a live monkey's liver to eat, and I shall get well at once." "A live monkey's liver?" exclaimed the king. "What are you thinking of, my dear? Why? You forget that we dragons live in the sea, while monkeys live far away from here, among the forest trees on land. A monkey's liver? Why, darling, you must be mad." Hereupon the young dragon queen burst into tears. "I only ask you for one small thing," whimpered she. "And you won't get it for me. I always thought you didn't really love me. Oh, I wish I had stayed at home with my own mama and my own papa." Here her voice choked with sobs, and she could say no more. Well, of course the Dragon King did not like to have it thought that he was unkind to his beautiful young wife, so he sent for his trusty servant the jellyfish, and said, "It is rather a difficult job. But what I want you to try to do is to swim across to the land, and persuade a live monkey to come here with you. In order to make the monkey willing to come, you can tell him how much nicer everything is here in Dragonland than away where he lives. But what I really want him for is to cut out his liver, and use it as medicine for your young mistress, who, as you know, is dangerously ill." So the jellyfish went off on his strange errand. In those days he was just like any other fish, with eyes, and fins, and a tail. He even had little feet, which made him able to walk on the land as well as to swim in the water. It did not take him many hours to swim across to the country where the monkeys lived. And fortunately there just happened to be a fine monkey skipping about among the branches of the trees near the place where the jellyfish landed. So the jellyfish said, "Mr. Monkey, I have come to tell you of a country far more beautiful than this. It lies beyond the waves, and is called Dragonland. There is pleasant weather there all the year round, there is always plenty of ripe fruit on the trees, and there are none of those mischievous creatures called men. If you will come with me, I will take you there. Just get on my back." The monkey thought it would be fun to see a new country, so he leapt onto the jellyfish's back, and off they started across the water. But when they had gone about halfway, he began to fear that perhaps there might be some hidden danger. It seemed so odd to be fetched suddenly in that way by a stranger. So he said to the jellyfish, "What made you think of coming for me?" The jellyfish answered, "My master, the king of the dragons, wants you in order to cut out your liver, and give it as medicine to his wife, the queen who is sick." "Oh, that's your little game, is it?" thought the monkey, but he kept his thoughts to himself, and only said, "Nothing could please me better than to be of service to their majesties, but it so happens that I left my liver hanging to a branch of that big chestnut tree, which you found me skipping about on. A liver is a thing that weighs a good deal, so I generally take it out, and play about without it during the daytime. We must go back for it." The jellyfish agreed that there was nothing else to be done under the circumstances, for, silly creature that he was, he did not see that the monkey was telling a story in order to avoid getting killed, and having his liver used as medicine for the fanciful young dragon queen. When they reached the shore of Monkeyland again, the monkey bounded off the jellyfish's back, and up to the topmost branch of the chestnut tree in less than no time. Then he said, "I do not see my liver here. Perhaps somebody has taken it away, but I will look for it. You, meantime, had better go back and tell your master what has happened. He might be anxious about you, if you did not get home before dark." So the jellyfish started off a second time. And when he got home, he told the Dragon King everything just as it had happened. But the king flew into a passion with him for his stupidity, and hallooed to his officers, saying, "Away with this fellow! Take him, and beat him to a jelly. Don't let a single bone remain unbroken in his body." So the officers seized him, and beat him, as the king had commanded. That is the reason why, to this very day, jellyfishes have no bones, but are just nothing more than a mass of pulp. As for the Dragon Queen, when she found she could not have the monkey's liver, why, she made up her mind that the only thing to do was to get well without it. All rights reserved. Y. Nishinamiya. Publisher and art printer. Tokyo. The Fisher Boy Urashima. By B.H. Chamberlain. Long, long ago there lived on the coast of the Sea of Japan a young fisherman named Urashima, a kindly lad and with his rod and line. Well, one day he went out in his boat to fish, but instead of catching any fish, what do you think he caught? Why, a great big tortoise, with a hard shell and such a funny wrinkled old face and a tiny tail. Now I must tell you something which very likely you don't know, and that is that tortoises always live 1,000 years, at least Japanese tortoises do. So Urashima thought to himself, a fish would do for my dinner just as well as this tortoise, in fact better. Why should I go and kill the poor thing, and prevent it from enjoying itself for another 999 years? No, no, I won't be so cruel. I am sure mother wouldn't like me to, and with these words, he threw the tortoise back into the sea. The next thing that happened was that Urashima went to sleep in his boat, for it was one of those hot summer days when almost everybody enjoys a nap of an afternoon, and as he slept, there came up from beneath the waves a beautiful girl, who got into the boat and said, I am the daughter of the sea god, and I live with my father in the dragon palace beyond the waves. It was not a tortoise that you caught just now, and so kindly threw back into the water instead of killing it. It was myself. My father the sea god had sent me to see whether you were good or bad. We now know that you are a good, kind boy who doesn't like to do cruel things, and so I have come to fetch you. You shall marry me, if you like, and we will live happily together for 1,000 years in the dragon palace beyond the deep blue sea. So Urashima took one oar, and the sea god's daughter took the other, and they rowed, and they rowed, and they rowed till at last they came to the dragon palace where the sea god lived and ruled as king over all the dragons and the tortoises and the fishes. Oh dear, what a lovely place it was! The walls of the palace were of coral, the trees had emeralds for leaves and rubies for berries, the fishes' scales were of silver, and the dragons' tails of solid gold. Just think of the very most beautiful, glittering things that you have ever seen, and put them all together, and then you will know what this palace looked like. And it all belonged to Urashima. For was he not the son-in-law of the sea god, the husband of the lovely dragon princess? Well, they lived on happily for 3 years, wandering about every day among the beautiful trees with emerald leaves and ruby berries. But one morning Urashima said to his wife, I am very happy here. Still I want to go home and see my father and mother and brothers and sisters. Just let me go for a short time, and I'll soon be back again. I don't like you to go, said she. I am very much afraid that something dreadful will happen. However, if you will go, there is no help for it. Only you must take this box, and be very careful not to open it. If you open it, you will never be able to come back here. So Urashima promised to take great care of the box, and not to open it on any account, and then, getting into his boat, he rowed off, and at last landed on the shore of his own country. But what had happened while he had been away? Where had his father's cottage gone to? What had become of the village where he used to live? The mountains indeed were there as before, but the trees on them had been cut down. The little brook that ran close by his father's cottage was still running, but there were no women washing clothes in it anymore. It seemed very strange that everything should have changed so much in 3 short years. So as 2 men chanced to pass along the beach, Urashima went up to them and said, Can you tell me please there Urashima's cottage, that used to stand here, has been moved to? Urashima, said they. Why, it was 400 years ago that he was drowned out fishing. His parents, and his brothers, and their grandchildren are all dead long ago. It is an old, old story. How can you be so foolish as to ask after his cottage? It fell to pieces hundreds of years ago. Then it suddenly flashed across Urashima's mind that the sea god's palace beyond the waves, with its coral walls and its ruby fruits and its dragons with tails of solid gold, must be part of fairyland. And that one day there was probably as long as a year in this world, so that is 3 years in the sea god's palace had really been hundreds of years. Of course there was no use in staying at home, now that all his friends were dead and buried, and even the village had passed away. So Urashima was in a great hurry to get back to his wife, the dragon princess beyond the sea. But which was the way? He couldn't find it with no one to show it to him. Perhaps, thought he, if I open the box which she gave me, I shall be able to find the way, so he disobeyed her orders not to open the box, or perhaps he forgot them, foolish boy that he was. Anyhow he opened the box, and what do you think came out of it? Nothing but a white cloud which floated away over the sea. Urashima shouted to the cloud to stop, rushed about and screamed with sorrow, for he remembered now what his wife had told him, and how, after opening the box, he should never be able to go to the sea god's palace again. But soon he could neither run nor shout any more. Suddenly his hair grew as white as snow, his face got wrinkled, and his back bent like that of a very old man. Then his breath stopped short, and he fell down dead on the beach. Poor Urashima. He died because he had been foolish and disobedient. If only he had done as he was told, he might have lived another 1,000 years. Wouldn't you like to go and see the dragon palace beyond the waves? There the sea god lives and rules as king over the dragons and the tortoises and the fishes, where the trees have emeralds for leaves and rubies for berries, where the fishes' tails are of silver and the dragons' tails all of solid gold,